Dr. John Stover, sociology faculty at Santa Rosa Junior College, writes that documentary filmmakers play a significant role in shaping activist histories long after the events have transpired. Documentary filmmaking is a vibrant form of social activism. Tonight, we meet a documentary filmmaker who advances social justice causes like inequality, racism, and discrimination. We're having this conversation at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. I'm so happy you're joining us.
From Los Angeles, this is KLCS PBS. Welcome to Everybody with Angela Williamson, an innovation, arts, education, and public affairs program. Everybody with Angela Williamson is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you. And now your host, Dr. Angela Williamson.
Curtis Chin is our guest. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into why you're here today, tell us a little bit about yourself, growing up.
That's a very open-ended question. I like to describe myself as being Detroit-born, New York-bred, LA-based, and London-bound. And I can sort of explain that all later. But
Definitely.
So I was born in Detroit, raised there. My family had long roots to the city, arriving, in the late 1800s or somewhere around there. Yeah.
Detroit.
Yes, there were Chinese people in Detroit even before there was a Ford Motor Company or Motown Music. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, they came from Canton, China, to Canton, Ohio, for some insane reason, and then found out there were no Chinese people in Ohio, and then they moved up to Detroit, where there were a few more. And so, at that time, Detroit was just, taking off, to become the giant manufacturing hub that it was. But they started off like most Chinese Americans doing the laundry, and then, when Chinese restaurants became really popular, starting in the 30s and 40s, they went into the restaurant business, and that's where we've stayed ever since.
And being in that restaurant business, it was a family affair, right? So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was started by my great-grandfather, and he brought in his two eldest kids. And so it was split between my half of the family and my cousins or second cousins they would be. And so it was always a big family affair. Whenever we would do things, everybody pitched in, and I grew up there. Worked my way up from being a busboy to washing dishes, to waiting tables, to managing. Just did everything. And so it was a really great learning experience, I think. I learned so many skills and just things about people working in that Chinese restaurant.
And do you think working in that Chinese restaurant is the reason why you probably chose your career path, or was it something different? Because you became a writer for television. Well,
I don't know if that has influenced my career. I think it's definitely influenced my personality. There's so many intangible things that you learn growing up in a Chinese restaurant. And one of the things I talk about is Detroit was a very racially polarized city between blacks and whites. But the Chinese restaurant is actually one of the few places where everybody would go. So you would actually see, people from the white community, the black community, the Jewish community, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the greatest lessons that I learned in that Chinese restaurant was from my dad, who was a person who himself had grown up in Chinatown, never went to college, but yet he found a way to have a conversation with everybody that came in through our door. And I think that taught me that it is easy to connect with people if you just try. And all you have to do is listen, and that, people, even if they have completely different backgrounds, you can find that point of connection. And he taught me not to be afraid of people that were different than me. And I think that these wonderful life lessons that you learn growing up, is what was so fabulous about being in a Chinese restaurant.
Okay, so now I want you to walk me through how you go from Detroit to, you mentioned Los Angeles. So tell me what happens to get you to Los Angeles.
Okay, this is my whole book that I'm writing. But
well, don't tell us the whole book. You're supposed to give us a teaser of it. So think teaser.
So I worked. So I'm writing this memoir called "Everything I Learned." I learned in a Chinese restaurant, and it's broken down like. The Chinese believe 888 is a good luck number. So it's 8 stories in elementary, middle schools, 8 stories in high school, and 8 in college. And I actually didn't want to go to college. I was one of those kids that just, was just going to travel around the world. I mean, but it was also, as a gay kid coming out at that time, AIDS was a big issue, and I just didn't think like, what was the point of staying 4 years in college, when, frankly, I could be dead in 10 years, right? And so I just had a different attitude about things. But my mom, being the type of person that she is and, wanting me to go to college and do things that she didn't have an opportunity to do because she was working in the restaurant, pushed me to go to college. And so I ended up going there. And, that's where I started my writing. I had never written before, really. And it was only because I got into a select creative writing program there. That really set me on that course. And so, that's how I became a writer.
And what university did you go to again?
Michigan.
Oh, of course. I didn't even ask that question.
Don't even ask that question. You're from Detroit. You got to go to Ann Arbor. Yeah.
Okay, so in my mind, you're still in Michigan. You start creative writing. How do you get working for television?
So I got into this great writing program at Michigan. They just launched this creative writing program for undergraduate. It was a highly select program to get in. I think they took somewhere between 15 or 20 people in the program. Yeah. It was tough. And so I got to take advanced level classes. But at the same time, it was also a challenge as a person of color in a writing program where I'm the only minority. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience.
Not at all.
But it's a challenge because of the way you're perceived and the way your stories are taken. And I actually had a terrible experience that actually made me leave school a little early, where this will be in the book, but I signed up for this advanced fiction writing class because and I was a poet at that time, and so most of my classes were in poetry, but I thought, I'm going to push myself and take a fiction writing class. And so I took this fiction writing class, and the lecturer, I think she was a lecturer, I don't think she was a full professor, but she said, you guys are young writers, you guys should write from a different perspective. And so, all the other writers in class wrote, from a different perspective. And they were white, and so sometimes they would write as a person of color, and they would say things that I didn't think people of color would say. Like, I love my almond eyes. We don't say things like that. And so I would always have to comment. And when it came time for me to read my piece or to write a piece and read in class, I decided that I was not going to follow her assignment because as a person of color, I don't get to read many stories, from a Chinese American perspective. And I was working full time and going to school at night. And so I thought, I have very little time to actually write. And so I'm not going to waste it on an assignment. I'm going to write something I want. And so I wrote this story about this kid growing up in Detroit, Chinatown, and having a crush on his Chinese school teacher. I turned it in. The other people in the class, they all really enjoyed the story. They said nice things, but my teacher didn't say anything. She just asked me to come to her her office hour the next day. And I showed up. And I thought, okay, she's going to bust me for not following the assignment. But instead, she first told me to stop talking about race in class because it was just slowing down the creativity of the other kids, other students. And then she accused me of plagiarism because she said, this story is too good to be from an undergraduate. And I thought, okay, this is not the right place for me to grow creatively. And so I moved to New York. And that was a great decision because I got to take classes with people like Entasaki Shange. I got to meet writers like David Henry Wall. It was just great, and it was much cheaper than being in college,
Yes.
So, and at that point, I met a lot of other Asian American writers, and we formed an organization called the Asian American Writers Workshop, which is actually still in existence today. It's one, the largest Asian American literary arts organization, in the country. And when I became the first executive director, but when I left, we had a budget of about $700,000 a year. We were giving, fellowships to writers of $10,000. So many famous writers, Asian American writers, have come out of that program. And so that sort of set me on that course. And so don't know if I don't know if I had intentions of becoming a TV writer. I moved out here more because of love, because the guy I was seeing at the time was out here, and we had a long distance relationship. And at some point, we said we should probably live in the same city if we're going out. And so, as a writer, I had more freedom, and so I moved out here. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and so TV seemed like an interesting job, and so I pursued that.
And how was it for you in the writer's room? We're talking about the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, being the only person of color is a challenge. And when I say I'm the only person of color, that includes the crew too. I mean, it's like completely, and so it is a challenge. I haven't completely processed all this stuff because that would be my next book. But you have to make compromises, or you have to position yourself in a certain way. So, for instance, I knew at that time, as an Asian American, I was doing sitcoms, right? And there's no such thing as the Asian American sitcom writers at that time, because they didn't really think Asians as being funny people, right? They don't think of, they don't, right? That's not the stereotype of Asians. We're not thought of as being as funny people. But I am gay, and people do think of gay people as funny. So I actually had to play the gay card more than the Asian card. You know what I mean? And so you know how when you wear multiple hats, you have to play different ones at different times. And so that was sort of, what I was thinking at that time. But yeah, no, I have stories of like the challenges of it. And, it was difficult. And, looking at it now, because it's been a good 15 years since I've worked in television, I see the landscape has changed so drastically, and I think that's really wonderful. But I know definitely, there are more opportunities now. And like even the idea of like some of the shows that I would think that I would love to write back then are probably not things that you could even tell your agent about, because they probably would have said, let's try to find something a little bit more commercial, something that we could actually sell. But I don't think that Asian American writers encounter that same situation now. At least that's not what I hear, because again, I don't work in that field anymore, but from what I hear is that you can, and if you read the trade papers, you actually see Asian American projects coming up. So I think that's a big change, and hopefully it's not a temporary fad, but something that's more, long lasting.
That will continue like a trend in a way, that it will be a trend. So before we get to our break, I want to transition you a little bit, because when we come back, you're going to talk about what you're doing today. But you end up leaving Los Angeles and going back home, and that really changes what you start to do next in your life. So tell me a little bit about that before we go to our break.
Yeah, I took a detour in life.
Yes.
I started making documentaries, which is a whole new field that I had, no training in. But it's been wonderful because I've been able to talk about social justice issues. But I also took another slight detour where I worked as one of the directors of outreach for the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. So I was doing some political work for a little while. So I just became much more political after my dad passed away, because I just felt like, this is where I can contribute. And so, yeah.
So when we come back, I want to hear about those changes, talk a little bit about what you did for the DNC and also the Obama administration. So hang on, we'll be back to talk to you in a few minutes.
When I was growing up, my mom was extremely tidy. We were trained to put things back where we got them from. One day, when I walked into my mom's house, I felt like I walked to someone else's house. There was stuff everywhere, and just growing up the way I grew up, and to see this transition was very alarming.
When Sean talked to me, it was a wake-up call, and that's when I went to the doctor.
I was horrified to learn how they followed him out, grabbed him, and held him down as they hit him with a baseball bat until Vincent's skull cracked, and how Vincent's last words were, "It's not fair," before he slipped into a coma and died.
Welcome back. Before we went to our break, you gave us a teaser, and I thought it was just one detour, but you said you had two.
Yeah.
So I want you to talk about those two ways that really change the way that we see Curtis Chin today, and how you really became much more involved in the political process.
While it may seem like I have all these different strands in my life, or I'm schizophrenic, they're actually pretty connected, right? I mean, they're all related to social justice work, whether it's I'm making a film, whether I'm on the lecture circuit, or whether I'm volunteering for a political campaign. It's all about equality. It's all about fairness. It's all about bringing more equity to our society and making sure that America lives up to the brochure that we put out, about, the type of country that we want to be. And so, yes, my primary work is in documentary filmmaking, but now also writing this memoir that hopefully we can talk about in a sec. But I've also done some political work. I did a brief stint with the Democratic National Committee, doing outreach to the Asian American community. But the thing that I've been most proud of is being invited to serve on Barack Obama's Asian American Leadership Council during his first presidential run. There was about 20 of us from around the country that were invited to participate in weekly calls to, talk policy issues, things that would be addressing our community, talking points, all this really fun stuff about the campaign. And anybody that had an opportunity to work on the Obama campaign, you just sensed a hopefulness and an optimism, that you want our country to get back to at some point. And so I still think of that as a great opportunity experience. Obviously after the election, maybe my opinions may have softened a little bit after you see the administration, but it was a great learning opportunity. But at the end of the day, like I said, it was about social justice. So.
And everything that you've done since is about social justice. And so tell me about, you talked a little bit about the book, definitely you can talk about that, but also too, there's some other documentary films that you've been working on as well that really fall under the social justice umbrella.
Yeah, well, I have to say that, given my bio, it was almost inevitable that I would get into this work, because not only was I coming of age during the murder of Vincent Chin, which is the hate crime murder that happened in Detroit, where a Chinese American was murdered by these two white auto workers who said it's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work. And so that shaped my racial identity. But I also came of age in the 80s during the AIDS movement. And so that inevitably shaped my sense of identity. And so I moved to New York and I became involved with groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation and protesting there. And I think between those two things, it was just sort of inevitable that I was, going to be political in some level, right? I mean, when it stares you right in the face like that, I mean, when these life and death matters confront you, do you run away from it? Do you pretend it doesn't exist? Or do you grab the bull by the horn and say, look, we've got to do something about this? And so that's what I've tried to do.
So you have done so many different things regarding social justice. And Vincent Chin, that makes sense because you grew up and you have personal connection, but you've chosen other topics as well to focus on in your documentary filmmaking. For example, Tested. So talk about, how did you determine that subject matter?
So Tested is a documentary that looks at the New York City public school system. They have these elite magnet schools, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, Brooklyn Tech, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're really world famous. So many top caliber people have gone through them. The issue is that the only way to gain admission is to take a single standardized test. And so when you look at the New York City school population, which is about 70% Black and Hispanic, but when you look at these top schools and realize that it's only 1% Black and 3% Hispanic, it becomes a giant I don't know, a red flag that everybody should be concerned with, like what's happening. And how this impacts the Asian American community is that at these schools, while Asian Americans represent about 15% of the New York City public school system, they're about 70% at these schools. But the interesting data point that I found was that Asians also have the highest poverty rate in the city. And so you can't necessarily make this correlation between race and class all the time. And so I really want to sort of explore that, how these things intersect with each other. And so that's what drew me to the topic. And obviously, as someone whose family, my mom never graduated high school. My dad went to, I think, a semester or two of community college. They really pushed education on us as a way to improve our lives. And so I'd always grown up with that. But as someone who, had gone through quite few different educational opportunities in the Detroit area, brief stint in the Detroit public schools, all the way to a well-to-do public school, in the suburbs, I saw the disparity, between, the opportunities, right, between the different school districts. So it's always just fascinated me, like how the kids that I knew in the Detroit school system probably had a different trajectory than the kids in these other school systems, and I was always just curious about that.
You spent so much time, especially with Vincent Who, and then also, I'm sure you're going to be doing this with Tested as well. You spend so much time going into colleges and universities. Do you ever have students ask you, like, how can they be a documentary filmmaker? Because they have their own issues they want to talk about, because normally when there's documentary filmmakers, they have those issues that are personal, or are they asking you other questions?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't think young people need to ask me if they can be a documentary filmmaker. I think they already assume they can be, because they've been living their lives filming already, right? I mean, that's the generation. They pick up things, they slap it up on YouTube, so they don't need permission. They're going to do it. So no, I think in terms of what they do ask about being a documentary filmmaker is more of the marketing aspect of it. Like, how do you get your films out there? How do you, get people talking about it? How can you get your film to have an impact? Because I think that's what they want. So, like, for instance, with our film Tested, despite the fact that the New York public school system did not want us to make the film and did everything to stop us from making the film, once the film was released, they were pretty happy with it, to the point where they started using it as a film to train their teachers and their administrators. They brought me out to New York like 3 times to do special talks with their staff. And so to me, that is hopefully having an impact on these policy things. And that's where, for me, that's the important thing about documentary filmmakers. It's great that people want to view these things, they want to learn about these issues, but I think it's also important that the decision makers also can grow from watching your film.
And you mentioned something and you glossed over it and moved on to the final point of what Tested has done and how it's being used. But you talked about those obstacles. I mean, the challenges.
Oh.
And so you mentioned the New York educational system, but have you had any other challenges that you've just had to decide to move forward to get the project done, and then all of a sudden everyone has a change of heart? Or is it pretty much just this one documentary?
No, I mean, there's always, independent documentary filmmaking is hard, especially if you want to make it for a living. If you want to do it as a side hobby, anybody can do it, and lots of people do it, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of people also have day jobs. I've been lucky enough not to have a day job, because I do enough screenings and get enough invitations to go out there. But the challenge, I guess, with any creative field is always how do you make a living doing it, right? And I don't know the answer to that. What's the best way to sort of do it? But I think it is finding the right subjects, and but it's not always easy. Like the current film that I was working on, I actually had to stop. I was making a film called Our Chinatown, which was looking at, this is pre-COVID, I was looking at issues of gentrification, overcrowding, of schools, and other issues that were really impacting the oldest Chinatowns in America. But then when COVID hit, not only did we have to shut down production, but the issues impacting our community had changed. It suddenly became more about hate crimes, right? And xenophobia and things like that. And so I didn't know if our film would be relevant anymore. And so I've sort of put the film on hold. But sadly, one of our subject matters passed away from COVID. And so we are now editing his story. He's a very famous photographer named Corky Lee. We are editing his story into a 20-minute short. And so I'll release that. So, but I think that's the one thing is you just have to be flexible and you try to figure out how to make these things work.
That's great advice. So before I close my conversation with you, tell our audience how they can keep in touch with you, because you have this new project coming out that you're going to do, this new 20-minute short. You may go back to the other project before COVID. Do you think you might go back to that project?
I think we can edit the other pieces that we did in the other cities as separate shorts, because then there isn't that pressure as a whole film for it to be as relevant, because then people can see them as isolated short pieces. So I might do that, but the first thing is just completing the Corky piece, just because this guy was a hero to our community. If people don't know him, please look up his work. I mean, he documented the Asian American community since the late 60s.
He was like an activist all in himself.
Oh yeah, he was big time. And to the point where it's like when he passed away in January, CNN did a story on him. The New York Times, the New Yorker, everybody covered him. I mean, so, we show a different side of him in our film. He gets very personal, talking about his journey as a photographer and the sacrifices that he's made in his life. And so that's why I really want to finish the film, because I want to show this other side to him that people don't get to see through the photography, right? Because you see his world through his eyes and his lens and the things that matter to him. And that's a wonderful thing, but you don't see the second side of him, right? That he was very guarded about in a lot of ways.
Thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for using your art for social justice. And you have to come back when that book, I'm going to find you. So you have to come back when that book is published, because I want to talk about that in depth. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on Everybody with Angela Williamson. Viewers like you make this show possible. Join us on social media to continue this conversation. Good night and stay well.